Dan, with everything going on, including the threat of nuclear war in West Asia, little attention is being paid to Trump's moves against Colombian President Gustavo Petro, which could well see him in a U.S. prison alongside Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro. Um, the dissident community is stretched so thin that it's hard to see how it can respond to this. But I think we need to see it as another front in a global war to crush dissidents and reestablish the global hegemony of the US and or neoliberalism. I said and or because I think there are more I think there are multiple dark forces in play here. Is there anything you'd like to say about that global strategy?
Yes, well, first, Dan, I wanted to mention today's the anniversary of the assassination of Saint Oscar Romero in El Salvador in
Oh,
1980, which I think is important to mention. Yeah, I mean, clearly the U.S. empire is now probably at its most aggressive, maybe ever, in terms of certainly the multiple wars it's fighting all at once everywhere from Cuba, which it really is at war with Cuba,
mhm,
to Iran.
mhm.
And I just saw, you might have seen today, there's an article by Nick Turse, who I like a lot in The Intercept. Pentagon reveals attacks in Latin America are just the beginning. The Pentagon has announced Operation Total Extermination, which will involve more U.S. strikes in Latin America. Beyond Cuba, these will include strikes in Ecuador. U.S. troops are on the ground in Ecuador right now. And also, they're threatening attacks on the Ecuador Colombia border, which Petro's been concerned about for a while, what's been happening on the Ecuador border. He's been concerned that the right wing government of Ecuador has been making maneuvers on the border and past the border into Colombia. He thinks to undermine him and his government. In fact, a couple weeks ago, I think 24 people were killed on the Colombian border within Colombia by Ecuadorian forces. Um, so yeah, there's a real war happening within Latin America, and apparently it's going to intensify. And as you said, well, there's a lot of ways to look at this, but I think one way to look at it is that the U.S. is trying to desperately maintain its empire, which is crumbling, uh, desperately trying to preserve the petrodollar, though what it's doing in Iran will probably destroy the petrodollar, but that's how things many times work. The more you try to grasp onto things, the more you tend to lose them, but that seems to be happening. Um, the world capitalist system is in grave crisis. And the U.S. right now sees war as the only way out of it. I think the U.S. has always seen war as that option to get out of crises and preserve its power. It's nothing new in that respect. But again, the wide-ranging nature of it and violent nature of it all at once is pretty incredible.
Well, why would it be launching strikes in Ecuador when Ecuador is an extremist right-wing government?
Well, it's working along Ecuadorian troops,
Oh,
allegedly to fight cartels.
okay.
Of course, at the same time, Ecuador just outlawed the main opposition party. So I think they're also there to shore up the government of Ecuador, right, against its own people.
Wow.
Um, yeah, so and I think it will be used also as a base of operations for the U.S. to project power into countries like Colombia, if necessary. Um, yeah, so I mean, it's a very dangerous moment, I think.
Um, Petro's recent visit to the White House and Trump's seeming agreement to let Colombia live seem to have been no more real than his negotiations with Iran, just a distraction. If the US takes out Petro and installs a puppet, Daniel Ortega and the Nicaraguan Revolution would no doubt be next on the list, and there's no telling how much longer Cuba can hold out. Can you help us think about how we can all respond in this moment? And first, how are you, as President Petro's lawyer, responding? There are two questions there. So why don't you first say how are you responding as President Petro's lawyer?
Well, first of all, we're trying to find out exactly what is happening, what is real and not real. So Friday, it was the New York Times published a piece based on anonymous sources saying that the Department of Justice is involved in an investigation against President
Right.
Petro for
Yeah.
alleged connections with drug traffickers.
Mm.
Um, Reuters that day said that Petro was not the target of that investigation, though his name was mentioned in it. Um, the AP said, in fact, that he was the main target of it. So there's a lot of questions about the nature and validity of all these claims.
Mhm.
And in order to verify them, you have to tread lightly
Mhm.
in terms of approaching the DOJ and that sort of thing about about an investigation. So I'm not really at liberty to say what we're doing, but we are going
Okay.
to do our best to find out what's happening and assure the government that Gustavo Petro is properly defended. Um, I don't see it very likely that the U.S. will, pull what they did with Maduro, that they would somehow seize Petro, arrest him. He was just allowed to go to Chicago for Jesse Jackson's funeral. That was March 6th.
Mhm.
I actually met with Petro then too.
Uh-huh.
He was allowed to come and go.
Uh-huh.
And then the next week he had a phone call with Trump and it went very well. And then the next week it's reported there's an investigation against him. So
And that the DA and that the DEA had identified him as a prime target.
right, that's the AP story, right? So it's hard to know what's really happening, but obviously we will hope for the best, prepare for the worst. I certainly think the U.S. wants to influence the upcoming May elections, presidential elections in Colombia. While Petro, under the Constitution, can only run, once, so his term will be up in August. His successor, Ivan Cepeda, who's even more left wing than Petro, is way ahead in the polls. I'm sure the U.S. is not happy about that, and I'm sure that this leak by the DOJ and DEA was intended somehow to influence the elections in Colombia. Though I'll tell you, if it is intended to undermine Ivan Cepeda, it's very much backfired because the Colombians really don't take to to the U.S. trying to interfere with the country. And Petro's the most popular leader in Colombian history. So his polls continue to rise as the U.S. escalates threats against him. So,
Right.
which is great. Um, but again, when you look at the U.S. assault on Iran, the U.S. kidnapping of Maduro, the U.S. strangulation of Cuba, I mean, anything is possible. Anything is
Mm.
possible.
Yeah.
So we need to be very careful with that. Now, you asked what can the kind of progressive forces in the U.S. do?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I mean, first, in terms of Cuba, there is There are activists in Cuba now that have brought humanitarian aid, which I think is great. Breaking the blockade. I think that is a great thing to do. I think any solidarity that can be shown with Latin American countries is important. Demonstrations, certainly educating people through letters to the editor, through social media about what's happening. All of that is important. Um, I wish we had a robust peace movement to
Yeah.
address all these things.
Yeah.
Especially now that the risk of nuclear war is greater than ever in human
Mhm.
history, and there seems to be no concern about that, or at least none being exhibited. Right? I
Widely,
would,
not widely.
yes, I would think that the upcoming No Kings rally may be an opportunity for progressive people to express these things. I mean, obviously, those rallies are kind of liberal operations, but leftists have gone to those and raised the issues of Palestine and other things. So, I mean, I think it's certainly an opportunity for the left to
Right.
express itself in a bigger way than it could on its own.
And
Yeah.
at the last rally in Washington, D.C., someone arrived and managed to get right near the front of the stage, in front of the cameras, and he raised a Palestinian flag way up high, way above way above all the other flags and all the other people, and waved it there the whole time. It was great.
Yeah, Pittsburgh, similar things have happened. So I think that's worthwhile. And even some speakers have been allowed to speak
Uh,
who've spoken about Palestine and other things.
yeah.
So it seems to me that's a worthwhile thing to do. Um, Again, I'd like to see like a big march on Washington for peace, and
Mhm.
against these wars. I don't know why we seem not to be able to pull that off. I mean, even the demonstrations right now, the peace
Mhm.
demonstrations that have happened are much smaller than were happening after October 7th, right? The
Mhm.
Palestinian protests were very, very big
Uh-huh.
for a while. Those then
Mhm.
became smaller, and we just have not been able to reproduce that. Again, even though the threat to humanity right now is really very grave. Um,
Yeah, well, go ahead.
no, I
Well,
don't know what the answer is to that. I wish I did, but I don't.
the No Kings rallies are huge. But No Kings and Indivisibles' primary concern seem to be ICE, which is
Which is good.
something,
It's
yeah,
important. And democratic forms and all that. That's all very important. I do think the progressive movement. There's the struggle they have is that there's so much happening at once. I understand
yeah,
it's hard to fight all. It's incredible the U.S. has the capability to fight all this at once,
yeah,
and it makes it very hard for the left to respond to all those crises at once.
yeah.
And I yeah.
Yeah, I found that very few people have even noticed the threat to Petro in Colombia yet.
Yeah, well, again, I think because of what's happening in Iran, which seems existential,
Yeah,
where nuclear weapons may be used and all. Again, I can understand why that was kind of ignored, but I do
yeah,
think it's very important. I mean, Petro, in my view, is one of the most important
hmm
leaders in the world right now. Actually, he just announced that during his term in office, he's lifted 4 million Colombians out of poverty. He's really done a lot for that country. He's been a real advocate for Gaza. He's been very critical of the war in the Middle East and the attack on Iran. And I think that's why they're sharpening their knives for him, and they're afraid, again, his successor, Ivan Cepeda, will continue that. And that Petro will continue it even when he's not president. So The danger is going to follow him for a long time, I think.
Well, I was just watching the CELAC meeting. I can't remember what CELAC stands for, but it's a meeting of Latin American leaders. And there was a lot of outrage being expressed, particularly by Brazilian President Lula, saying what in the UN Charter or anywhere gives one country the right to own or invade another country.
Well, in
Um,
fact, the UN Charter is very explicit that countries don't have that right, and that in
yeah,
fact it is the greatest crime to attack another country, when not provoked. And that's exactly what the U.S. is doing. So what the U.S. is doing is in violation of the most basic tenets of the UN Charter. But again, Trump is pretty open about the fact
yeah.
he doesn't care about the UN Charter or any international law. Um, and he's going out of his way to show that. So, and what has the UN done to protect those principles? Nothing,
Mm,
really, right?
yeah.
I mean, in fact, it was very disappointing that the Security Council did not manage to condemn the U.S. Israel attack on Iran, but they did manage to condemn Iran's defense
Yeah.
of itself. So everything's backwards. I mean, right now, the forces of good are really, they're not fighting back in the way they should because uh, the forces of darkness are winning and they're winning big.
Well, Petro said at the CELAC meeting, Petro said, we need words and we need people in the streets.
Yeah, well, that's all true. We especially need people in the streets in the US because
Yeah.
that's where these terrible policies are emanating from. I mean, really, it's up to Americans to stop this. But Americans seem distracted. I would say very passive, caught up in kind of self-soothing activities like video games and smoking pot um,
Sports.
and sports.
If we could turn out the crowd that shows up for a team that's victorious in the NBA championship or any of the major league that turns out for NBA, NFL, or MLB champions, uh, we we would have accomplished a great deal.
Oh yeah,
We could fill the
riot.
streets.
They'll even
Yeah,
riot in the streets in
yeah.
celebration.
Do you
Well, in
think
the yeah,
do you think that I mean people did not turn out in the streets for Maduro after Maduro was arrested that in the way that they did for Cesar Chavez. Not Cesar. In the way that they did for
yeah. That
Hugo
Cesar
Chavez.
Chavez is another issue. We
Yeah,
won't get
let's
into that
let's
today.
drop
Yeah,
that issue.
yeah.
Um, in the way that they did for Hugo Chavez. Do you think the crowds would turn out in the streets for President Petro if he were threatened or
In Colombia
yeah,
or in
in
the
Colombia?
U.S. Oh, in Colombia, yes. I mean, I saw something this morning, a video. He appeared at a university, and when the students found out he was there, I mean, you can see people charging into the building, running into the building to see it.
Oh,
Absolutely.
okay. Oh,
There
okay.
and there have been huge demonstrations that he has spoken to. There's been huge demonstrations in support of Ivan Cepeda as well. Oh, there's no doubt. I mean, I think that Colombia would be on fire if they did a Maduro uh, uh, type kidnapping of Petro. No, there's no doubt. Um, yeah, I find it a little strange that that didn't happen in Caracas.
Well, that's really promising that you're so sure it would happen in Colombia.
Yeah, I mean, Petro's a rock star there, and especially amongst poor people and working people, young people. And it has always been a very political in a very politically active country, and that's why the U.S. has targeted it so long for counterinsurgency activity. It's a very robust country
Mm-hmm.
politically. So nothing like that could happen to Petro without major opposition.
Is it accurate to say that Petro leads a movement, not just a political party?
Yeah, I definitely think that's true. That's
Okay.
and that's why he's been so successful.
Okay. Now, Trump's claim that President Petro is a narco trafficking kingpin could not be more ridiculous and hypocritical. Critical. Um, the Department of Justice says realized, they've quote unquote realized that the infamous cartel de los solos is no more than slang, as if they ever thought otherwise. But they say it's not. The cartel de los solos is not a narco trafficking ring that Maduro ever could have headed. Um, it was just bleep thrown at the wall to see if it would stick. And now they're charging Maduro with government corruption with drug money, whatever that means. And I don't know how they could plausibly claim jurisdiction. That would be a domestic issue in Venezuela.
Of course, of course.
Do you think they'll be able to make those charges stick in a U.S. court?
I'd like to think not. I think they are completely meritless. The other issue is he's a sitting head of state. Even Trump said that. Trump recently said that he's the proper president of Venezuela, and that means that he cannot be charged. He has sovereign immunity. So I don't see how a judge can allow these charges to go forward unless that judge is totally corrupted by the political process.
Okay. Um, as to the hypocrisy of the accusations, uh, Trump pardoned Honduran drug kingpin Juan Orlando Hernandez, who was convicted in a U.S. court of trafficking 400 tons of cocaine into the U.S. and sentenced to 45 years. Trump didn't say a word about anything wrong with the evidence in that case. Not, not a word. He just said that Hernandez hadn't gotten a fair shake under the Biden administration. Now, I wonder why he would do this unless he and or one or more of his cronies were mixed up with Hernandez, or unless it was the result of an outright bribe in the money laundering shadows. Can you imagine any other reason for this?
Well, it's because he is compliant with U.S. policy, as is his party. Nothing. Meanwhile, the government of Ecuador is very involved in the drug trade, though the U.S. is very close to that government.
Mm-hmm.
The former president of Colombia, Alvaro Uribe, was listed on the DEA's most wanted drug traffickers, and yet the U.S. gave his government $10 billion when he was president. So, I mean, drugs has nothing to do with this. The CIA, we know, funded cartels in Mexico, of course, ran cocaine for the Contras in the 80s. So, I mean, we just have to start from the proposition that this is just a pretext. It's
Mm-hmm.
right. It's not valid.
Yeah,
Um,
okay. The other stuff, we can't prove it, so leave it alone. 'Cause, I mean, my thought that somebody in the administration must be mixed up or it must be an outright bribe. How else could this happen? But you're saying it's just he's one of ours. So
he's one of ours, and
Trump sees
that's
him
all
as
that
one of ours.
matters.
Yeah.
Right.
But I mean
Yeah.
there were some elements in um I'm not sure it was just the Biden administration. I don't know how long that trial went on, but there were some elements that saw him convicted and sentenced to 45 years.
And I think he was convicted by a jury. So, I mean, it's very
Yeah.
hard. I mean, I think there's probably no better litmus test for. I mean, obviously, people are wrongly convicted every day, but I would think that they're, there was very good basis for believing he was a drug trafficker. So, but again, none of that matters as long as you're a compliant leader, you can do whatever you want. Um, well, look at Netanyahu. I mean, he's the
Uh,
greatest human rights violator in the world, and the U.S. supports him to the hilt. So,
well, I also want to note that Trump also pardoned Ross Ulbricht, who was the creator of the dark web market, the Silk Road, where you could buy any sort of drug or even arrange to hire a hitman for whatever purpose. And Ulbricht had been sentenced to life in a federal prison. If you had any concern about drug trafficking, you would support that conviction. Now,
yeah,
go ahead.
no, obviously. Um, and again, the U.S. foreign policy has often been supported by the drug trade, right? The CIA ran heroin to support the South Vietnamese government. Again, ran cocaine in the 80s to support the Contras. Um, the U.S. supported the drug cartel in Colombia to fight the Medellin cartel. So, I mean, and also remember the Fast and Furious scandal where Obama had sent arms to cartels in Mexico. I mean, it's just the whole thing's ridiculous. And then you had the whole Afghanistan
Oh,
uh,
the heroin
thing.
trade. Yeah.
Yeah, where when the U.S. invaded Afghanistan in 2001, the Taliban had basically eradicated poppy production in that country. And then by the time the U.S. left, Afghanistan was
Yeah.
providing the world with 85% of its heroin.
Yes.
Even while you had the CIA and the U.S. military running around all of Afghanistan, somehow it went from producing no heroin to producing 85% of the world's heroin. So, what's going on here? I
Yeah.
read a Guardian article years ago that said that 50% of the money in Western banks is laundered drug money. That if you didn't have drug money in the banks, this whole system would collapse. So the whole thing is so corrupt. Um, so yeah, you have to just think about those things when you consider these claims.
Okay, I got one question about that. With regard to Maduro's trial, since you're a lawyer, uh, would this flagrant hypocrisy matter if it were brought up in the court trying him? Could it matter in a U.S. court, or would that just be beyond what are called the merits of the case?
What's that? That the U.S. supports drug traffickers and
Yes,
other
yes.
instances? Yeah, I would say I that would probably not help. It probably wouldn't help it. But again, I think there's better arguments, and the better arguments are that again he has sovereign immunity. That whatever claims are against him, as you said, are purely domestic claims. Um, which, by the way, again, the UN Charter under Article 2.7 prohibits states from interfering in the purely domestic policies of other states. So the U.S. has no, you know, legal right to be doing what it's doing against Maduro. And
Okay.
I hope there's some rule of law left in the U.S. that will see Maduro released.
Okay, is there, excuse me, is there anything else you'd like to say about all of this?
I would just say that look, resistance is possible. I think we always have to be reminded of that. And when people often express to me, "Oh, it's futile," and we have big marches, it doesn't do anything. I point to the recent massive demonstrations in Minneapolis, St. Paul, where they drove out ICE. I think that we have to look to models like that we can make a difference through mass protests. and we cannot lose hope. If you are an activist, hope has to be, your greatest attribute. Because if you lose hope, you'll lose the will to keep fighting, and we need that right now.
Okay, Dan, thanks so much for speaking to Black Agenda Report and Pacifica Radio.
It is such my pleasure, Ann. Thank you.
Okay.